In the summer of 2008, 30-year-old German tourist Markus Weber disappeared in the Utah desert. His rented car was found abandoned near an abandoned motel, and the man himself was never seen again. The official version was simple. He got lost and died of heat. But 8 years later, in the sands nearby, they came across something that forced the police to reopen the case. A rusty metal safe buried in the ground hid something no one expected. In the summer of 2008, 30-year-old German tourist Markus Weber arrived in Utah. He rented a small gray car and headed out into the desert, where he dreamed of seeing the places described in tourist brochures: red rocks, canyons, and silent roads stretching through the dry heat. The car was found abandoned near an old motel, but the traveler was never seen again. Markus was born in a small town near Hamburg. He was known as a non-conflict person, attentive to details, and a bit reserved. He worked in information technology, but his true passion was traveling. A few years before he disappeared, he visited Iceland, Scandinavia, and the Pyrenees. His colleagues noted, Weber always planned his routes to the smallest detail, carried a notebook with him, and carefully recorded time, place, and expenses. So the decision to go to Utah seemed like a natural extension of his traveling style. He arrived in the United States in early June. From the airport, he rented a car, took out insurance, and booked a few nights at a hotel in Salt Lake City. His last confirmed contacts were emails to his sister and mother. He wrote that he wanted to see the canyons and stay in small towns that reminded him of the scenery of old westerns. The letters were full of enthusiasm, but also a strange sense of haste. He emphasized that he was not going to stay in one place for long. It is known that in the first week of the trip, he visited several tourist sites: Arches, Bryce Canyon, small villages, where he photographed old gas stations and abandoned cafes. The camera that was later found in his hotel room contained dozens of pictures of desert roads, lonely trees, and bizarre rocks. In none of the pictures were there any people with him. It seems that he was purposefully avoiding crowds. The last official record of his movements came in the form of a receipt from a gas station near the small town of Green River. It was the 9th day of his trip. After that, all traces of him were lost. The next time his car was seen was by employees of an old motel on the side of the highway. The car was locked, but inside were a backpack, a road map, and several bottles of water. It was also strange that the keys were left in the ignition, and the driver's door was half open. The old motel near where it all happened had long since lost its customers. Its rooms were closed with wooden boards, the windows were broken, and weeds were growing around. The owner, who lived nearby, said that he had seen the last customer in the early 90s. The place became a haven for random travelers, homeless people, and those who did not want to attract attention. Therefore, the appearance of a rented car near the motel looked suspicious and immediately caught the eye. Inside the car, the police found no signs of a struggle. The passport, wallet, and camera were in the glove compartment. On the back seat was a road guide in English with pencil notes. On several pages, remote areas of the desert were marked, not tourist sites, but secondary roads that led deep into the deserted plateaus. It remains a mystery why Markus was interested in them. Locals later recalled seeing a man with a European accent several times in a nearby shop and cafe. He would buy water and dry goods and ask about old mines and abandoned buildings in the neighborhood. Some described him as being too curious about topics that even the locals usually avoid. In small towns where everyone knows everyone, this behavior stood out. But no one suspected any danger, until the car was left in a deserted parking lot outside a ghost motel. Markus had no problems with the law and was not involved in crime. His bank cards remained inactive after the date of his disappearance. His phone went dead for good. It seemed that he had simply disappeared into thin air. The only thing the police immediately noted was that the car had been sitting in the sun for several days before someone called the patrol. During this time, the tracks in the sand could have been erased by the wind. The family in Germany received a report of the disappearance through the embassy. It came as a shock to them. The trip to Utah had seemed like a safe adventure. Marcus's sister told reporters that he had dreamed of this trip for years and considered the desert a place where you could feel real silence. Now, the silence became a symbol of his absence. There were only a few artifacts left: an abandoned motel, a car with his belongings, and a gulf of uncertainty between the last recorded day and the moment someone first noticed the car. All of these details formed the basis of a case that quickly grew from a formality to a real mystery. Utah, with its red-hot rocks, endless roads, and shadows of the past, hid the tourist as easily as it had swallowed caravans of gold miners. Marcus Weber was listed as missing. The official documents had a dry wording: probable death in desert conditions. But even then, there were too many inconsistencies in the details of the story that hinted that it was not an accident, but something else. After Marcus Weber's rental car was found near an abandoned motel, the local police launched a standard missing persons procedure. At first, everything looked like a routine situation: a tourist who recklessly went into the desert without proper preparation. But the foreign nationality of the missing man and the strange circumstances forced the county sheriff to immediately notify the government services. Within hours, patrols, trucks with equipment, and tents for a coordination center appeared near the motel. The weather did not allow for any delay. The June sun was scorching the ground so hot that even the stones seemed to be red hot. The daytime temperature reached over 40 degrees, and at night it dropped sharply, creating dangerous drops. In such a climate, a person without a sufficient supply of water can die in a matter of hours. That's why the search operation was launched as widely as possible. Dog handlers, volunteers from neighboring towns, rangers, and the State National Guard. In the early days, it seemed that finding the tourist was a matter of time. The dog teams started with the car. The dogs were allowed to smell Marcus's belongings inside: a t-shirt and a notebook. The smell was clear, and at first the animals led the searchers south, toward the low hills. But after a few hundred meters, the trail was lost. The wind carried the scent, and the sand absorbed any prints. This was not a surprise to the experienced rescuers. The desert rarely retains clear traces for more than a few hours. At the same time, a helicopter with a thermal imager was lifted into the sky. From the air, the desert looked like an endless maze of canyons, ravines, and dried-up streams. The pilots peered closely at the monitors, looking for any thermal signals, but the equipment recorded only heated rocks and isolated coyotes. No human body, even an exhausted one, could be seen. The airplane made several dozen circles, but there was no hint of Weber's trail. Volunteers were working on the ground. They moved in chains, divided into sectors. Each had a radio and a supply of water. They were looking for anything: a piece of cloth, a food wrapper, a bottle cap. But the desert made only its own noise: the scraping of sand underfoot and the soft whistling of the wind. Every day brought exhaustion and disappointment. The sun burned his skin, his lips cracked from the heat, and the dust clogged his lungs. The rescuers were especially careful to check the dried-up streams and hollows where the traveler could look for water. One of these routes looked promising. The dogs lingered near a small hollow, but found no new tracks there. Only a few old tin cans and shards of glass from a long broken bottle. Nothing that could be linked to Marcus. Days passed, but there were no results. On the fourth day of the operation, several volunteers fainted from the heat and had to be evacuated. Water supplies were brought in by truck from the city, but even they were running out faster than planned. People were working to the limit, and the longer the search lasted, the less hope there was. The press quickly picked up the story. For journalists, it was a dramatic picture. A German tourist, an abandoned car, the desert, helicopters, and dogs. Cameras filmed the headquarters, interviews with exhausted volunteers, and comments from officers who repeated the same thing. We are doing our best, but the conditions are extremely difficult. The family in Germany gave interviews through the embassy, urging them not to stop the search. But even they received less and less optimistic messages every day. A week later, it became clear that there was virtually no chance of finding Marcus alive. The police officially announced the first working version. The tourist got lost, wandered too far from the car, and died of dehydration. The desert does its work with bodies quickly: predators, heat, winds. Even if he fell into a ravine or fell victim to a wild animal, the traces could disappear in a matter of days. For official documents, this explanation seemed logical and complete. But among those who were on the ground, the feeling was different. As if the desert itself had hidden the stranger in its silence and left no clues. Not a single piece of clothing, not a single bottle, not a single signal. Only a silent car outside the motel and the endless space around it, which swallowed up all the answers. 3 weeks have passed since the search operation began. All available resources were used: dog handlers, helicopters with thermal imagers, volunteers, local rangers. Not a single trace. The desert remained silent. At the rescue headquarters, the words hopeless and budget depletion were heard more and more often. Officials saw the only way out was to curtail active operations and transfer of the case to the category of probable death. The FBI, which became involved in the case due to the international outcry, conducted a formal investigation. The agents were interested in possible criminal factors: robbery, kidnapping, and attacks by local groups. But all the facts showed the opposite. The car was intact, the belongings were in place, and the bank cards and documents were not missing. There were no signs of a struggle. Medical and insurance certificates obtained through the embassy also contained nothing suspicious. The only working version sounded simple. Marcus Weber, having recklessly stepped away from the car, got lost and died of dehydration. The reports used the same phrase: desert conditions, no water, high probability of death. In the final documents, the case was classified as probable death in the desert, no body found. For the bureaucratic machine, this meant de facto closure. There was no evidence of a crime, so no further investigation was needed. The official report was sent to the German embassy in Washington. From there, the papers were handed over to the family. The letter was short and dry. Your son is presumed dead in the desert in Utah. Despite extensive search efforts, his body has not been found. The case is closed. For the mother and sister, these words sounded like a sentence. No farewell, no burial, not even an imaginary place to leave flowers. Just a paragraph of official text with a stamp. The family could not accept it. In Hamburg, journalists tried to get a comment, and Marcus's sister answered, "We don't believe he just disappeared. He was cautious. He always planned his steps. Such a person does not go into the desert without water and does not leave the car open." But for the American investigators, these words had no weight. All the evidence pointed to an accident, and the case, from their point of view, was over. In the FBI's archives, Weber's disappearance quickly became another line in a long list of unsolved cases. The phrase unsolved did not mean a mystery. It was just a technical designation that the body had not been found. Statistics knew of dozens of similar cases in the deserts of Nevada, Arizona, or New Mexico. Tourists underestimated the heat, confused directions, and lost their bearings. Nature finished the job quickly and without a trace. The locals were indifferent to the story. Several short articles appeared in the newspapers, repeating the official version: desert, heat, recklessness. Only the detail of the abandoned car near the motel added to the story's eeriness. But even this detail gradually lost its sensationalism. In a few months, no one remembered the German tourist. The family tried to get a second investigation. The mother wrote letters to the embassy, and the sister turned to the German media, hoping to put pressure on the American authorities. But the official response was always the same. All possible resources have been used. There are no results. No one planned to fund repeated expeditions. For the bureaucratic system, the case was closed, even if the family was left in the dark. In the towns of Utah, the story became a local legend. A store owner recalled seeing a stranger with a backpack. A cafe worker said he was asking about old mines. But official records did not take into account memories without evidence. For the investigators, it was just a rumor. On paper, everything fit. The tourist went to the desert, did not return, the body was not found, the case was closed. This was the official version, an accident typical of desert states. But for those who had seen the car with his belongings, for those who had heard about Weber's strange questions in the stores, for those who had felt the eerie silence around the abandoned motel, this version never sounded convincing. It satisfied only reports and archives, but not those who were looking for answers. The official version of the Weber case seemed to be complete. The report stated that he had died in a desert environment. That was enough for the police and the FBI. But in the small towns of Utah, stories did not close so easily. Where official documents put an end to the story, other explanations were born in conversations in bars and roadside cafes. The first stories to circulate were that the tourist was seen in the company of strangers. One trucker claimed that he stopped at a gas station near Green River and saw a tall man with a European accent talking to two locals. According to the witness, they looked like miners or seasonal workers, dirty clothes, black hands, and an old pickup truck. The trucker was sure that it was Marcus Weber. There was confidence in his words, but no proof. The police recorded the testimony and put it in the archive. Another witness, a small shop owner, recalled that a man with a German accent asked him about old mines. He asked if there were any abandoned tunnels or underground passages nearby. At first, the owner took it as a tourist's curiosity, but after the disappearance, he connected the conversation to the events. He later told journalists, "He didn't ask about canyons or parks. He asked about places where no one has been for a long time. I thought it was strange." In local bars, Weber's story quickly became a legend. Some said he had come across people looking for gold. Others said that he himself had become part of a deal and paid for it with his life. The Utah desert has long been a place for stories of hidden treasure. In the 19th century, gold miners operated here, leaving rumors of hidden caches. Some of these stories lived on, passed down from generation to generation. The legend of the safe attracted special attention. It sounded different in different versions. Some spoke of a bank safe carried by bandits in the early 20th century. Others claimed that the safe was buried by miners when they were fleeing from the tax authorities. One thing was common: a safe with valuables, hidden in the sands and never found. Over time, the missing German tourist began to be associated with this legend in these stories. An old bartender in the town of Price used to tell his customers, "He asked about the safe. I remember it well. He was sitting at the table drinking coffee and asking if it was true that there was an iron chest somewhere in the desert. I told him it was just a rumor, but He listened intently. Other clients confirmed that the foreigner did ask a lot about local tales. Over time, this detail, the safe in the sands, became the main one in all the stories. For some, it symbolized the search for adventure. For others, the reason for the disappearance. The logic is simple. If he was looking for a safe, then he must have come across someone who was also looking for it. And in the desert, there are no chance encounters. In fact, there was no evidence of the existence of the safe. The archives contained only fragmentary references to robbers and miners. But in the imagination of the locals, an iron chest buried among the sands looked more realistic than the version of ordinary death from heat. Psychologically, it was easier for people to believe in a conspiracy or hidden treasure than in a meaningless accident. Journalists who came to write stories about the missing tourist always found someone who had heard something. Some said that Weber was walking in the company of two unknown men. Others claimed to have seen him in a bar with maps and drawings. There was no proof, but the very fact of the stories created an atmosphere of mystery. For the family in Germany, these rumors were a double burden. On the one hand, they gave hope. Perhaps he did not die in the desert. On the other hand, they hinted at something dark that he might have gotten involved in. Marcus's sister said in an interview, "We cannot believe that he simply died of the heat, but it's even harder to believe that he was looking for some treasure and got into trouble. It's not like him." Thus, the disappearance of one tourist gradually became a myth. In bars and coffee shops in Utah, people kept mentioning the safe again and again. Some claimed the it was still lying somewhere under a layer of sand. Others said that it had been found long ago and that Marcus had accidentally stumbled upon those who didn't want to share their find. All of these versions remained at the level of gossip, but they kept interest in the case when the official documents were already closed. The official authorities did not respond to the rumors. For the investigators, the safe was nothing more than a legend, and the conversations in the bars were useless chatter. But in the memory of the locals, Weber's story was no longer just an accident. It turned into another spooky desert tale with a safe buried in the sands at its center. 8 years have passed since German tourist Marcus Weber disappeared without a trace in the Utah desert. His story had long since become a local legend, and official reports were gathering dust in the archives. The case was considered closed, and only his family in Germany continued to contact journalists from time to ask them to remember him. For the locals, the topic became just part of a collection of strange stories about the desert. In August of 2016, two enthusiastic friends who were searching for metal objects in abandoned areas went deep into the plateau. Their names were Lance Pearson and Craig Martin. They were not professional archaeologists and did not have special permits, but such trips were not uncommon in Utah. Local metal detecting enthusiasts were looking for coins, pieces of equipment from old mines, or even military remnants. For Pearson and Martin, it was a hobby that often yielded only rusty nails and meaningless pieces of metal. That day, they decided to investigate a site near an abandoned motel, the exact spot where Weber's car had once been found. According to them, this place has always been of interest because of the legend of the buried safe. Both admitted that they didn't really believe in the tales, but hoped to at least come across some old miners' tools. The sun was baking mercilessly. The sand and stones were so hot that the air was shaking. The instruments gave the usual signals on the fragments of tin cans and old bottle caps. After almost 3 hours of fruitless searching, Martin heard a dull, low signal that was sharply different from the others. They started digging. At a depth of about half a meter, a rusty edge of a metal surface appeared. At first, they thought it was a pipe fragment, but when they started to dig further, they realized that the surface was flat, massive, and had clear contours. Gradually, the corner of a metal box emerged from under the layer of sand. It was large, square, rusty, and extremely heavy. Pearson immediately said, "It's a safe." All the legends about the chest in the sand suddenly came to life. They realized that it would be impossible to retrieve the find on their own. The safe was buried in the ground and weighed several hundred kilograms. An attempt to open it with a crowbar resulted in only scratches on the rusty surface. Then, the friends decided to do something that is not usually practiced in such circles: call the police. They argued that the safe might be of historical value or contain hazardous materials. The call to the sheriff's department came around 6 in the evening. At first, the officer on duty thought it was a joke. The story of a buried safe in the desert sounded too much like fiction. But Pearson and Martin were persistent, explaining that the object was clearly massive and old. An hour later, a patrol car arrived at the scene. The officers found the two men near a hole, inside of which a rusty metal cube was indeed visible. They took pictures of the discovery and passed the information on to their superiors. At night, an additional group arrived with equipment. They began to carefully excavate the safe and record the process on camera. It was clear that it had been in the ground for many years. The metal was corroded, but the structure remained strong. When the safe was finally pulled to the surface, several cars with flashing beacons were already parked around. The place was fenced off with tape, generators were running, and light was shining in the darkness. The audience realized that anything could be inside, from bank papers to ordinary junk. But the tension was palpable, especially because everyone remembered the missing foreigner whose story began right here, near this motel. They tried to open the safe on the spot, but the lock was so rusted that no tool could help. It was decided to transport it to the laboratory of the forensic center. The officers carefully documented everything: the coordinates, the soil condition, even the nature of the rust. The safe was covered with a tarp and loaded onto a truck using a forklift. That night, Pearson and Martin stood by, watching their accidental discovery turn into a full-blown criminal event. For them, it had started as a hobby, but it ended up involving them in a case they had long thought was buried in the archives. They didn't know what they would find inside, but they had a feeling. The safe would hold the key to a mystery that had haunted the county for nearly a decade. As the truck headed toward the city, the desert remained as dark and silent as ever. Only the dust raised by the wheels slowly settled on the stones. 8 years ago, a man disappeared here. Now, at last, the first real clue had appeared. The safe, lifted out of the sand and transported to the forensic center, immediately became the main focus of attention, not only for the police, but also for journalists. Officially, it was labeled as an unknown large metal container found in the Utah desert. However, everyone who stood near it was well aware that inside could be the solution to the disappearance of the German tourist, which had been considered forgotten for 8 years. On the first night, the safe was left under guard. The metal was so rusty that there was a danger of damaging it by improper actions. In the morning, a team of technicians and forensic experts gathered in a special hangar. The atmosphere was described as almost ritualistic. Everyone knew that they were about to look into a cache that had been under a layer of sand for years. The procedure was documented with precision. Photographers took pictures of each stage. The safe was placed on a lift so that it could be reached from all sides. The rusted lock would not give in, even after several attempts to open it with special tools. Only after an hour of work did the craftsman manage to cut through the metal, and the door slowly opened. The silence in the hangar was almost absolute. Inside, in the dark interior of the safe, they could not see anything at first. But when a lamp was shown into the gap, the picture became clear. A figure was sitting at the bottom, a skeleton in a hunched position. The bones were almost completely preserved, although the tissues had long since decayed. The skull was tilted to the chest, arms bent and resting on the knees. The remains of clothing were found along with the skeleton. Fragments of a light-colored shirt, a belt with a metal buckle, and scattered shoe fragments. A document was found in his pocket, a German passport. The cover was damaged, the pages were glued together in a single stuck block, but the name and photo remained legible. It was Marcus Weber's passport. Everyone who saw the picture spoke of shock. Even experienced experts who had worked with various cases admitted that the case was unusual and eerie. Instead of the expected papers or bank documents, the safe hid the body of a man who had been missing for 8 years. The atmosphere of the hangar changed. It was no longer just a find. It became a crime scene. The forensic experts immediately began to describe the process. The remains of the tissue were carefully removed and packed separately. The bones were fixed in the position in which they had been lying for years. It was obvious. The skeleton was not accidentally in the safe. The pose in which he was sitting lacked naturalness. It seemed that the body had been shoved inside and left. The condition of the metal structure was also important. The door was locked from the outside. This excluded the possibility that the person had hidden and locked himself. Someone deliberately closed the safe after the body was inside. Journalists waiting outside the center learned about the discovery the same day. News headlines read, "Desert safe opened, body inside." The story instantly gained international publicity. Weber's family in Germany received confirmation that he had died. But how exactly remained an even bigger mystery. The photographs of the safe and the official confirmation of his passport proved that the legends about the buried chest were true. The only question was why it was there. Experts immediately speculated. Premeditated murder, concealment of the body, possibly related to the same stories about gold caches or other illegal activities. But despite the official nature of the procedure, even for experienced investigators, this moment was more than just a work phase. For 8 years, the desert had been silent. And now, when the safe was opened, it seemed to exhale its dark secret. After the opening of the safe and the official confirmation that it was the body of Marcus Weber that had been found, the investigation entered a new phase. What had been considered a tragic accident for 8 years now looked like a carefully concealed crime. However, already at the first stage, there were disputes between investigators as to whether the tourist could have been inside the safe himself or whether it was a premeditated murder. Formally, both versions were considered. Supporters of the suicide hypothesis pointed to a psychological factor. A person could have been wandering in the desert for a long time, lost hope, and, having come across the safe, used it as a grave. This version was supported by the idea that sometimes in a state of despair, people commit illogical acts. But at first glance, it had weaknesses. The most obvious was that the safe door was locked from the outside. It was impossible to close it and block the mechanism on your own. Another group of investigators insisted on the murder version. For them, the key was the locking. Someone deliberately locked the safe and left the body inside. This meant that Weber was killed, or at least deprived of the opportunity to resist, and then hidden in an iron box, hoping that the desert would do the rest. And for 8 years, she remained silent. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined the bones. Despite the years, the skeleton was quite well preserved. Several ribs and the left collarbone had fractures, but their shape did not match the typical injuries caused by a fall or accidental blow. Doctors suggested that these could have been the consequences of a strong physical impact, a blow with a blunt object or pressure. Particularly alarming was the fact that the fractures had occurred during his lifetime. The bones showed signs of tissue reaction, indicating that he had been injured shortly before death. Special attention was paid to the bones of the skull. A crack was found on the parietal part, which could have been the result of a blow from a heavy object. Its shape did not correspond to a fall into a ravine or down a slope. The angle and nature of the damage indicated direct and purposeful contact. This cast doubt on any accidental explanation. The press was quick to pick up on the findings. Headlines appeared in newspapers. Marcus Weber did not die of the heat. He was murdered, and the safe in the desert was not a suicide. The journalists emphasized that the story, which had once been closed with the phrase "probable death in the desert," now looked like a deliberate cover-up of a crime. However, not everyone agreed. In internal reports, investigators discussed the possibility of suicide over and over again. Some believed that the fractures could have appeared after death when the body was compressed in a cramped safe or under the weight of sand. But the forensic experts insisted that at least some of the injuries had occurred during life. They also examined the clothes. Dark spots were visible on fragments of the shirt, which could have been blood. But due to time and corrosion of the iron, the analysis was difficult. The laboratory confirmed the presence of traces of protein structures that corresponded to human blood, but it was not possible to identify the group or origin. All of these findings added to the arguments of the murder theory. If the tourist had really been beaten, he could not have gotten into the safe by himself. And even if he had, the door still remained locked from the outside. This was a key fact that was hard to ignore. Discussions lasted for weeks. Some experts wrote in their reports about the high probability of a violent death. Others kept the wording cautious. Cause of death is unknown. But there was no doubt on the sidelines. Someone had killed Weber. The only question was who and why. For the family in Germany, this news was another blow. For 8 years, they had lived with the idea that he had simply died in the desert. Now it turned out that everything was different. Marcus's sister told reporters, "If it had been an accident, we would have accepted it. But now we know that someone planned his death. This is even harder." The investigation was officially reopened. Old documents were pulled out of the archives, and the case was reclassified as a potential murder. The desert, which had been a secret for years, was once again in the spotlight. The discovery of the safe with Marcus Weber's skeleton stirred up not only the police. Dozens of journalists came to the scene, but one in particular stood out. The American reporter Sarah Collins worked for a regional newspaper and had a reputation as a stubborn researcher. Her stories often dealt with forgotten cases, and it was these stories that brought her the most attention. For her, the discovery of the safe was a challenge. The official investigation was slow, and people wanted to understand how a body ended up in an iron box in the middle of the desert. Collins started with the archives. In police reports from the late 90s and early 21st century, she found references to a series of strange arrests in the same county. Back then, law enforcement officers were chasing a small group of smugglers who were transporting valuables across the desert. The documents referred to metal containers used for transportation. The details were vague, but the word containers strangely resonated with the safe that had been in the sands for so many years. The journalist found several former officers who had participated in those operations. One of them confessed on condition of anonymity. "We knew they used safes, ordinary bank safes that could be attached to a pickup truck or buried in the ground. They hid jewelry, money, and sometimes weapons inside. The safe was a way to complicate the work of the police. Even if the car was stopped, it was impossible to get to the contents without keys." Reports indicated that the group was never completely eliminated. Several people were convicted, but the core of the network remained in the shadows. And the most interesting thing is that the area where the safe with Weber's body was found was once the location of their roots. The parallels were becoming obvious. Collins tracked down another document, an interrogation report of a man detained in 2002. He stated that there will always be caches in the desert because no one is looking there. He also hinted that some safes were buried on purpose so that they could be retrieved later. The protocol was not directly related to Weber's case, but to the journalist, it looked like a clue. If the safes were indeed used by smugglers, it is quite possible that Marcus came across one of these caches, or the people who guarded it. Collins's materials did not immediately make it into print. At first, the editor was hesitant. There was not enough evidence, only fragments of old protocols and hints from former officers. But after the publication of the photos of the safe, public interest was so great that the editorial board agreed. The article, titled "Smuggler's Safes and the Death of a Tourist," made the front page. The reaction was loud. Local residents who had been telling legends about the iron chest in the sands for years received confirmation that these were not just fables. Old stories about smugglers came to life again. Some people mentioned the names of people who disappeared from the town at the very time when the police were conducting operations against the smugglers. Others claimed to have heard about caravans of safes that stretched across the desert at night. The police refused to comment officially on the stories. In their reports, they continued to use the phrase, "Cause of death is unknown, investigation is ongoing." But unofficially, some investigators admitted that the smugglers' version looked realistic. The circumstances coincided too much: the safe, the neighborhood, and the nature of the injuries on the bones. For Weber's family, this information was another blow. If earlier they had lived with the idea that he had been the victim of an accident, now they were faced with the image of a man who had accidentally encountered dangerous people. In an interview with a German TV channel, his sister said, "We don't know what he was looking for in that desert, but if he really came across those who were hiding something, it explains why they tried to make his death invisible." Collins's article gave the case a new impetus. The FBI was forced to go back to the archives and officially verify the data on the smugglers' safes. However, even for federal agents, time was working against them. The documents were incomplete. Most of the members of those groups had long since disappeared, and the routes were covered with new layers of sand. Nevertheless, a clear picture emerged in the public mind. The tourist from Germany did not die from the heat. His death was linked to old shadowy networks that used safes as hiding places. And if this is true, the people who once operated in the desert could still be alive today. After the publication of Sarah Collins' article about the connection between the safe in the desert and smugglers' activities, a real stir was created around her name. Readers wrote letters, the editorial office received calls, and people shared their own rumors and versions. It seemed that the story of the German tourist's death had finally emerged from archival oblivion. But at the same time, an invisible enemy began to put pressure on the journalist. At first, it looked like an accident. Late one night, she noticed a car with its lights off parked outside her home on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. When Sarah approached, the car abruptly drove off without even turning on its lights. The next day, an unsigned email arrived at the newsroom. It contained one sentence: "Stop before it's too late." Collins passed the message on to her colleagues. The editor advised her not to attach any importance to it. Threats are not uncommon in the world of journalism. A few days later, however, she received a second email, this time with a specific reference. "You don't know what those people were doing in the desert. Stay away from the safes." The message was sent from an anonymous server, and the sender could not be traced. The journalist realized that someone was reading her materials carefully and reacting nervously to her attempts to get to the truth. She notified the police, but the officers reacted with restraint. There was no evidence of danger, and the anonymous letters did not amount to a criminal offense. She was advised to be careful and to provide additional locks on her doors. Meanwhile, Collins continued her work. She met with former law enforcement officers, trying to find those who remembered the operations against the smugglers. Some refused to talk, while others hinted that it's better not to stir up old stories. In one of the cafes, she had a conversation with a former employee of a transportation company. He recalled that in the early 2000s, safes with unknown contents were indeed transported in the desert. He stopped talking as soon as he realized that the journalist was taking notes. Sarah was becoming more and more convinced that Marcus Weber's death was no accident. It seemed to be part of a larger scheme, a transportation system in which safes were used as hiding places. And if his body ended up in one of these containers, it meant that he had either accidentally witnessed it or had come across those who did not want to be exposed. One evening, she received a phone call from an unknown person. His voice was distorted. It was impossible to determine his gender or age. He said briefly, "Stop. Otherwise, you will end up like him." The line was immediately disconnected. This call brought the situation to another level. The newsroom set up a call recording, but the caller could not be traced again. Sarah had no doubt that someone was still watching the area where the safe was found. Someone, perhaps from those old networks, remained active and ready to intimidate those who raised the topic. She felt that Weber's story was not the past, but a living thread that stretches into the present. The editors discussed the possibility of stopping the series of articles. But Collins insisted on continuing. She believed that the truth about the tourist's death was more important than the risks. In her notes, she wrote, "This is not an accident or a suicide. It is part of a scheme. If the safe with the body was in the sands for 8 years, it means that someone expected us to never find it. But it turned up, and now we have to ask all the questions." The police did not officially comment on the threats. The case files contained only the wording, "The journalist received anonymous messages. Threats to her life have not been confirmed." But for Sarah herself, it was a real reminder that an invisible shadow continued to follow her every move. Her conviction only grew stronger. Marcus Weber's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a chain. And the person who locked the safe with the body in the desert was not acting alone, but on behalf of a network that could survive for decades. After a high-profile publication about the safe in the desert and anonymous threats to the journalist, the case of Marcus Weber came back into the spotlight. But despite the public outcry, the official investigation was slow. The FBI and local police exchanged reports, reviewed old protocols, and conducted new examinations. All this created the appearance of work, but there were no concrete answers. The safe with the skeleton was transported to a special storage facility. It became material evidence in the case, which has now been officially classified as a cold case. The rusted metal structure stood behind glass in the forensic center like a museum piece. The door still showed traces of corrosion, and the lock, locked from the outside, remained the main symbol of the whole mystery. For investigators, the safe was evidence. For journalists, it was sensationalist material. And for Weber's family, it was the only physical answer to the question that had tormented them for 8 years. The forensic experts never reached a consensus. Some insisted that the injuries to the bones were indicative of violence. Others remained cautious, repeating the phrase, "The cause of death is undetermined." In the final documents, a note appeared. The investigation is ongoing, no final conclusions have been reached. This meant that the case remained legally open, but virtually no one had any new leads. For residents of small towns in Utah, the story gradually turned into another fable. In the bars, people were again talking about buried safes, smugglers, and a foreigner who was looking in the wrong place. Some claimed that he had accidentally stumbled upon the criminals. Others believed that he was looking for the treasure himself. All these versions were not supported by facts, but they kept the interest alive. The desert was once again overgrown with legends. Weber's family in Germany received an official notification of the results. His sister told reporters, "We have a body, but we don't have the truth. This is even harder than the unknown." For them, the safe was not a symbol of an answer, only a symbol that someone had deliberately hidden a person, and had done so in such a way that the traces would remain in the sands forever. Journalist Sarah Collins continued to write new materials. She argued that Weber's case was just the tip of the iceberg, and that there were still hideouts in the desert connected to past smuggling networks. However, the editorial staff began to reduce the volume of publications. The audience's interest was waning, and no new facts were emerging. Only the threats that Sarah received after each article remained a reminder that someone was watching her words closely. For the police, the safe became another mystery that was conveniently filed away. Cold case is a phrase that means both openness and hopelessness at the same time. No one officially closed the case, but no one knew where to go next. The reports were dry. No new evidence, no version confirmed. The desert returned to its silence. The tire tracks left by the police and journalists were erased by the wind. The old motel continued to stand with its windows smashed in, as if it were looking at the highway with empty sockets. There was nothing to remind us of the night's operation where the safe was found. Only the sands that rolled endlessly under the sun, hiding and erasing everything that the man had tried to leave behind. The ending was a strange duality. On the one hand, the mystery of the missing tourist was partially solved. The body was found, and his passport confirmed his identity. On the other hand, there was no explanation as to who locked the man in the safe and why. The case was not closed, but it was frozen, like dozens of other mysteries scattered among the rocks and ravines of Utah. And now, as the sun sinks over the red plateaus every day, the desert is once again plunged into silence. In this silence, there is a feeling that the truth is buried deeper than any safe.